When Mr. Marner's wife returned to him through Regen Services, it seemed like a miracle. I remember the day pretty well, despite it being so long ago. 6 years back, the van drove past my son and I at our beaten-up basketball hoop, almost unnoticed. It was that discreet. If anything stood out in hindsight, it was that the windows were way too tinted, almost black, and normally this wasn't anything I consider strange. Only once it parked behind Mr. Marner's home did it catch my attention, as well as the other handful of neighbors that were outside that windy Friday afternoon. Since his wife's passing a month previous, the only visitors the old man had were his daughter and a few members of their church, so of course a strange visitor would stand out regardless of who they were. In truth, sad as it was, the main spectacle was that our neighborhood was not the place where a Regen van would stop for business. It was equivalent to seeing a Ferrari parked outside a crack house. "That's the Brain people, right?" Bry had asked, the basketball tucked under his skinny pale arm as he slid himself under my own, still clingy in the way I would come to miss at the arrival of his preteen years. For now, he was still just 10 years old. "The ones from the TV?" "Yeah, that's them." I was distracted by trying to spy the hubbub from our little hilltop apartment parking lot. I saw Bry frown from the corner of my vision and interpreted his suspicious quiet before he could finish setting up his throw. I caught the basketball before it could slam into my gut and grinned at him. I led him across our imaginary court on the asphalt with a dribble and made like I was about to slam dunk, a quick distraction from the curiosity churning in my gut, but Bry saw through it and yanked the ball from my grip. He seemed pretty invested in our game, or at least I thought so before he ran to the edge of the lot and stared down at the spectacle going on outside Mr. Marner's home once more. "They're opening the van," he spoke up as I returned to his side. "So that's what one of them looks like open. The van's all full of lights and computers and stuff." Aggie Manilow said in art class one time that, what's the word? Yeah, they brought back her dad a little long ago and that's why she was gone for so long after winter break. They were celebrating. When the late Mrs. Elipidoff Marner stepped out of the van as a princess might a carriage, I understood why they would have celebrated. I'd been one of the people that ran to Mr. Marner's ate that cold early morning when he'd stumbled out of his house and laid in the cold powder snow with his hands clutching his chest. His next-door neighbor asked if it was his heart, but he'd shook his head and just pointed a shaking finger toward the dark interior of their home. It was as though the yawning mouth of the open front door whispered the news before my brain could string together the logic. Sally Marner was pushing through her late 80s, and a week prior she had fallen in her garden. She was stuck there, under the thick cotton weave of the sky's blessedly unshed snow, before her husband Willard returned from the dialysis appointment their daughter Robin had driven him to. Mrs. Marner was back home from the hospital and in palliative end-of-life care before the sun was set the following day. Of course she was gone. Of course she would die. But her husband was still so shocked, so pained, as if no amount of prepping, even a lifetime's worth of knowing and understanding the concept of death, could prepare him for her loss. Through my feelings of condolence, I was overtaken by jealousy that her love could be so strong its lovers are devastated, that death can so much as touch it. So when an identical Regen van showed up in front of my home the day my husband came home from the hospital, too confined to a brief remainder of life in palliative care, I was stunned and was at my door before either of the men who left the vehicle could knock. They didn't seem the sort to be driving a car like that, the kind of van that usually held equipment for a plumber or electrician. Their suits were finely pressed, if a bit ill-fitted, but they were the sort of tall and slender that could pull off that sort of poorly kept aesthetic without appearing bummish. Can I help you? I saw the question was almost for myself. What could they possibly need from me? If this is a sales call, I'm sorry, but frankly, I could never afford your services. Derringer, the tallest of the pair, smiled with enviously straight white teeth. You already know my name. That certainly left a foul taste in my mouth. We've travelled quite a long way to meet you, he continued. Please, may we come in? I thought about my son. He would be home in about a half hour, depending on the school bus, and my husband on oxygen in the living room behind me. Still, the Midwestern aspects in me fought with the two halves of their dual nature, the wanton hospitality that saw how tall and skinny these young men were and wanted to bring them inside to the corn muffins I'd made that morning, and that ever-present knee-jerk reaction of get off my property. And what new property it was, having only been purchased a few months prior. It felt good to finally have a stable home and to own the land beneath it, even if it was squalid and a constant work in progress. I don't know why I let them in. I wished I hadn't, the moment they crossed the threshold of our front door. The air felt cold, despite the roaring fireplace behind us. My husband lay soundly asleep on the living room sofa. The hospice nurse said our bedroom upstairs would be harder on all of us to keep him in. The oxygen machine my husband was attached to made rhythmic huffs in time with his slowed breathing, clicking as the thinnest hand on the clock might tick away seconds, a moment divvied on a wheel. Every successful draw of breath he took in on that sofa, I anticipated being his last, and wondered if my oxygen would go with him. I'm Holt. The taller boy with blonde hair past his ears held out his hand, which I didn't take. He curled his fingers in and smiled, as though he were pretending not to choke on bitter food. And my partner here is Vince. Partner is in... God, no. Holt laughed the sort of way someone did to shake loose tension, like unwinding the cap on something fizzy to drink. He's not my type. We're sorry for your loss, Vince said with a suddenly morose tone, and it smacked me in a strange sort of sting. He hasn't passed yet, I said. Apologies. It's just that, having done this for so long, it's impossible not to see the writing on the wall, and if you don't accept our offer, it may be the only time we can outstretch our condolences for the hardship on your horizon. If this is your idea of a sales tactic, I'd highly suggest another field of work. I began bitterly, seating myself in the armchair across the love seat the two salesmen seated themselves on. Is that your method, to bully us poor potential widows and widowers into buying your expensive services by making us fear the outcome we're already resigned to? Sorry to burst your bubble, but that sort of perverse psychology won't work on me. You mean reverse psychology? Vince attempted to correct me. No, I showed my teeth in a mama bear smile. I do mean perverse. We offered hope, Mrs. Derringer. The tallest one outstretched his hand to me to shake. I was surprised by its roughness, his skin dry and leathery, like a farmhand's. Reminded me of being on Daddy's old farm. He'd sold it off a few years after I'd married Christopher, and I kicked myself, every so often, for not taking Bri there when we had the chance. I wonder if I'd misinterpreted the salesman's over-long blonde hair as a surfer's, when in reality he was a bit country woods, like me. Don't mind him. He doesn't have the capacity for fully appreciating the delicate nature of this subject yet. He's training. We're all new. Vince sighed wistfully. He's also prone to saying vague, yet somehow comforting statements of the obvious for some reason. Always quirks with newbies, regardless of him. Mrs. Derringer, we've got a proposition for you. Have you heard about Regen Services, ma'am? Was I imagining it, or was Holt's accent noticeably becoming more and more oriented toward the south? An old neighbour of mine, he used your product a few years ago. Other than the results, I'm not sure I know anything else about it. The ads on television at the time made it seem like some sort of memory regeneration service. When the van arrived at his house, I expected him to be taken away for testing or something, not for his late wife to walk out as if she hadn't passed away. I see. Let's start with our company name here. Here. He handed me a brochure printed on fine cardstock, which I laid out on the table before us, a texture that bordered on luxurious. I didn't realize paper could feel like it cost a fortune before. It felt like I wasn't wealthy enough to hold it. Regen is short for Regeneration, as I'm sure you've guessed, and our services are, well, I just sell the stuff, and let me tell you, it does sound too good to be true. That's why we only offer it to those we know are in, well, dire straits. Dire, I repeated. Derringer, what's the likelihood of your husband recovering from his accident? Bince asked. I don't see how any of this is any of your business, either of you. And, frankly, I've beaten my tongue, but how the hell do you people know so much about our situation? Was it the hospital? That's a violation of our rights if they shared our private medical information with your company, and I don't know much about lawsuits, but... Derringer, Holt spoke again, I can assure you of all that's above our pay grade. We're armed with whatever information our supervisor provides us with, and we're meant to make a wholehearted sales pitch. Which I guess ends in this question. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if no one had to die from some stupid mistake or accident? Age. Sometimes we can't help that, but you can consider us like life insurance. Only instead of financial support, we ensure that you won't have to go without your loved ones before their time is up. Get out of my house? I could feel the disgust in my mouth, oily and bitter over the syllables. Please. But I kept the brochure clutched in my hand. When the two of them had left, with their black-on-black van down the road and almost out of sight, I opened the brochure and turned toward my husband. His eyes were open, sunken, as the motor function to open and close them was sporadic since the accident. He needed his eye drops again, but I put my eyes on the brochure first. Perhaps I should have let them do their whole spiel. A lot of the jargon printed was complicated and twisty. They think they can save you, Chris, I murmured, as I used the lubricating drops on his dark eyes, gummed up with drying eye fluid. His pupils fluttered, and I wondered if it was recognition or fear. I wonder if I should let them try. Then Bry, now 15, found the pamphlet, and I no longer had a choice. I'd have to let Regen Services bring my husband back from the brink? Free, I repeated myself for likely the dozenth time. My breath fogged up the glass of the observation room, where I watched the Regen scientists and doctors put my husband into a medical coma. This portion I wasn't worried about. Especially because he'd been put under and in comas, both natural and induced, several times since the incident almost a year ago now. The rest of the process was the nerve-wracking part. I still couldn't believe this was even something that exists, much less something I didn't have to pay for. Remind me of the success rate? The nurse minding the vitals from outside the room smiled, knowing I'd asked the same question about every 10 minutes. 80%, Mrs. Derringer. The 20 that didn't make it were much, much older than your husband and had a whole slew of health risks. I have full faith he'll pull through. I tried to let that comfort me. If I was honest, nothing about this comforted me, even the notion of my husband getting a new lease on life. I was too nervous, teeth practically chattering from the way panic had me freezing. But I'd be a fool not to take this opportunity, and Bry would never forgive me if we didn't at least try. "They're dosing him with another sedative now," the nurse explained as I watched one of the doctors in identical blue medical coveralls accept a syringe from a nurse in a similar get-up, only white in colour. "This one is a local anaesthetic for the tube they'll insert at the base of the skull. And, some of what they're doing is stuff I'm not trained on. I'm vitals and prep support. They'll place them in the special Regen isolation chamber, so we won't be exposed to any more germs or bacteria, and from there he'll get wheeled off to the other room where they'll perform the procedure. We can't watch that part. They say we wouldn't want to see it regardless. All these months of blood and tissue samples, physical exams, and the waiting. It's so, it's terrifying. I couldn't help but admit. I think it's supposed to be scary, but it makes the recovery that much sweeter, the nurse smiled. It will be like your husband is as good as new. And it will keep looking just like him? I asked, biting my nails. The regenerated version of him? I can't help but hate the idea a brain transplant into the cloned body of the person they're transplanted from. It's like all the humanity in me is twisted up over it. You believe in God, Mrs. Derringer? No, not really. Sort of, I suppose. I rubbed my head, struggling to absorb the reality of where I was and what I was doing to the man I'd married over 20 years ago. I mean, there's got to be a reason why we're all here as a species, right? Maybe I do believe a little more than I thought. Maybe that's why this feels sort of wrong. I wasn't asking about it for you to go worrying like that. I'm sorry. I was going to ask, you want me to pray with you? The nurse asked me with a tone so kind it sprung tears in my eyes, and wordlessly I nodded. Then I'll pray with you, come here. When they at last brought my husband back, there was a strange feeling of relief, like I'd been holding my lungs so still from fear of breathing. It felt as though if I'd moved wrong, everything would come toppling down. Bry was in the waiting room with both sets of his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, my sister and her kids. He stood up and ran to me, excited but scared all at once. At 15, this was one hug I was going to treasure, as I rarely got them these days. I tousled his hair and nodded at our family. It had begun. Waiting was agony, as waiting usually was. Hours rolled by as Bry slowly whittled away at my sparse stash of dollar bills and quarters for snacks and drinks. Ordinarily, we limited those things at home, but right now I had more important things to worry about than a few cans of Mountain Dew. I don't understand why it couldn't be done in a regular hospital, I caught Mama complaining to Daddy. He didn't care much for hospitals anyways, but some hoity-toity medical facility was even less his speed. I couldn't really disagree. The waiting room we sat in was more like one for a spa than for a facility where they were gutting my husband's brain like a jack-o'-lantern and shoving it in a copy of his own body. Though, frankly, I didn't know what a waiting room for something like that should look like anyway. This place gives me the heebie-jeebies. They need to do it wherever they can, Greta, Chris's mother snapped. Please, keep your complaints to yourself. It's not your child's life on the line here. I'm still confused how it got to this point, Chris's father chimed in. Chris was healthy as a horse. All of a sudden, he has a stroke that knocks him out a window, and then he's paralyzed from the neck down, still having seizures and strokes. He choked up. It isn't right. Me and you, he looked to his wife. We're supposed to go first. Whether it ain't right or ain't fair, it's still your boy, Daddy said. Be strong for him. Mark, Louise, Daddy's right, I insisted, desperately wanting the subject dropped. As if I hadn't been plagued by my husband's health and potential recovery enough already. We have to keep faith. Rich, coming from you. Louise scoffed, but no one said anything more on the matter. Mama. Bryce sat beside me and leaned his head on my shoulder. No matter what happened, whether my husband lived or not, this moment in between the beginning and the fallout was more precious than gold. This man is not my husband. It started small. The doctors assured me that his memory would be fuzzy, jumbled even, but it would write itself out over the course of months. It had been over 3, and each time after his monthly 3-day stays at their facility, to observe him and make sure his new body wasn't under any sort of duress or rejection of the procedure. Each time he came back, his memory was stronger than the last time he went and was brought back. Our son was thrilled, of course he was. No son wants to lose their father. I was hesitant, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or maybe even for Chris himself to drop. It was unnerving how, right he seemed. He'd needed almost no recovery time after the procedure, and his scarring, though there, was minimal. I had expected many things, even miracles, but not total rewriting of what I thought I knew about science and reality as a whole. Bry wouldn't have noticed, but a wife knows he chose the wrong cereal. That was the first thing that rang with wrongness. I'd left our bedroom early on the Saturday morning and found him crunching away on the same sugary cereal as our son on the sofa while they watched some local hockey game on our living room television. Such a small thing. And under normal circumstances, I supposed a wife would take it as a father trying to bond with his son. But the thing was, Chris was very particular about his foods. He didn't enjoy sweets, and he didn't enjoy hockey. He was a football man, through and through, and he'd totally blown up at Bry over the fact he wanted to play hockey over Chris's preferred sport. He was reading more and faster than ever before. At first, I chalked it up to his quick recovery and free time from his lack of employment. His job at the construction company had graciously given him an equivalent position to his old one at a site a bit farther out than his previous one, a whole new crew included, but it wouldn't start for another 2 months, given it was the winter. Before, it was only ever magazines or the few books he'd read over and over in his life. Old Yeller, Where the Red Fern Grows, even the Harry Potter books since he'd taken a liking to them when he read them to our son some 10 years ago. He was reading everything now, as though no amount of words was enough to consume. Historical non-fiction about ancient Rome, cheesy romance novels, cookbooks. I'd even caught him with an astrology book on more than one occasion. A true, dizzying mix of information. Was it the new lease on life? I told myself over and over it wasn't strange, he was just changed. I'd catch him peering through the cracked door of our son's room at night, watching him while he slept, the way he did when Bry was a child, and finally able to sleep on his own. He'd pet our dog for sometimes upward of an hour, not while multitasking, just sitting and staring with a vacant sort of smile. When I spoke to our Regen caseworker, she informed me that it was simply him adjusting to his new body, a body without pain. A body which may end up living an extended lifetime thanks to its newness. I supposed it made sense in its own way. The important thing to me, though, was that he no longer hit me. Of course, I didn't tell the staff at Regen Services that. The bruises that used to regularly discolor my skin from shoulder to knee were almost gone, just scars. and permanent discolorations of burst blood vessels and blown veins that were easily enough explained away as varicose at my age. It was harder to hide the marks from Bry when he was younger. Wearing rash-guard swim shirts and trunks to the public pool definitely helped, and I made certain to change only in the privacy of the bathroom or bedroom when he became old enough to start registering that Mummy had marks on her body that weren't normal. Chris caught me examining myself in the mirror. Our eyes locked in our reflections in the bedroom mirror, my mouth frozen half open in shock, and instead of lashing out at the sight of his handiwork or slamming the door shut at presumably his own disgust, he moved in to embrace me from behind. He held me gently where I stood topless. The intimacy so rare and confounding, it almost hurt worse than any blow he'd ever delivered to me. And as soon as it started, it stopped. He left, and I wondered if the moment had ever happened at all. The final puzzle piece was when I woke up uncharacteristically early, around 4 a.m, and found that my husband wasn't in bed. This wasn't unusual. Since his recovery after the Regen procedure, there were many nights where he'd wander out of our room, saying he'd walked around the neighbourhood or read some more, totally antsy and raring with energy. I'm unsure if I'd caught him on a rough night or if this was genuinely what he had been doing each night he'd slid out of bed, but neither answer soothed me. I saw a light coming from the living room below. I thought about some mornings where I'd found him conked out on the sofa and decided I'd bring him a blanket just in case he'd fallen asleep down there again. The light, however, was coming from the hall bathroom, the one we rarely used except by guests. The door was ajar and I could hear a voice. He was muttering just above his breath, in a slow and monotonous manner I'd never heard from him before, and it sounded so foreign, drawn out, repetitive, a strange forced lilt in the centre of otherwise almost hypnotised tones. I crept as close as I dared, fearing the floorboards would give me away. Was he sleepwalking? I moved closer, letting the shadows hide me. As I watched my husband stare at himself with an expression so blank, it was as no facial muscles, save for the necessary ones to speak, were used, and only slightly at that. I caught on to the repetitive sentence structures once they began to make sense, his voice droning almost like the way I'd imagine an insect would speak. Christopher Derringer. I am 46 years old. Your favourite, my favourite colour is green. I was born in July, the 7th month. My wife is a lovely woman named Audrey, and we have one child, one son, a boy. I am a boy. No, a man. I am a man. I work in construction. I am afraid of heights. I have a scar on my left elbow from a surgery. It means I can no longer play football. I love football. I was shaking. The voice was my husband's, yet something totally different. The sound felt like it bore into my ears, the way the vibrational ringing of a bell might when standing beneath. Ching, 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 ching. The blanket fell from my arms, a soft sound that normally would go unheard if not for the stillness of the night. I wanted to run away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. At best, I had caught a man trying his best to recover from a traumatic surgical procedure, doing what he could to regain his memories, and at worst, most sinisterly, this man was not my husband. Not actually. And it was the option that made the most sense. I had lived with Christopher Derringer for 22 years and knew him better than anyone. What set him off? What encouraged him? What made him tick? None of those attributes were part of him anymore, and now I finally had the understanding, the confirmation of why. Our eyes met through the reflection of the mirror, mine visible through the sliver of warm light slicing across me through the ajar bathroom door. I expected shock, anger, even sadness, something to cross his face. Not a smile, not a warm, loving smile. He turned to face me and opened the door to pull me into an embrace. Our chests pressed into one another, two heartbeats thumping at drastically different rhythms. His was perfect and steady. Mine raced as though I were being constricted by a python. Christopher hadn't hugged me with any sincerity in over 10 years. Not since the drinking, since the layoff he'd had way back then, when he'd first laid his hands on me with something other than love. He cupped my hand in his, new skin, without the calluses of all the years of hard work he'd put into his craft. I thought absently about how that would make his job that much harder when he returned in the coming weeks. "I know what he did to you," Christopher said, in a voice both his and of someone new. "I've also seen the memories of you through his mind. They're all so new that I have to teach them to myself as if I'm a schoolboy learning a lesson from a video on an AV cart. Do you remember those?" "Christopher." I didn't know what to say. I guess I hoped hearing his name would snap him out of this odd state and bring us back in the ballpark of the game we'd been playing since our son was 5 years old. "I know what you did to him too," he continued, and my blood was hardly different than ice pumping through my body at what felt like 14th. He saw you that last time. You'd been dosing his bourbon with shots of antifreeze, but he wasn't sure for how long. Just that it suddenly made sense why he was so sick. He'd just finished a drink when he caught you topping off the bottle. You fought, struggled, and it was you or him. One of you was going through the window, and he was too drunk, and you were too tired. "Christopher." I understand. I see through his mind's memories. As much as I'm him, I'm also someone new. I swear to whoever or whatever you believe in or whatever is in charge in this world that I will never, ever lay a finger on you the way he did. Maybe it's because this body is new sober. Or maybe it's payback for what he did for you, and the universe is setting it right. Either way, I'm here, and I will make our lives so much better. Don't you see, you'll never have to flinch when I'm near you again, or sleep afraid that I'll wander in drunk, looking for a punching bag. I'm exactly what you need, Audrey. Please let me love you." We kissed tearfully. I'm not sure whose tears I tasted on our tongues, but the salt danced across my palate the way blood used to when he'd launch his fist in my direction so many times before. I wanted to believe him, to trust that the nightmare, the long, groaning nightmare of waiting to die at his hands, or to be caught for his death at my own, was over. It was over, it had to be. Because this man was not my husband, and I don't think I mind in the slightest.